Today we're going to talk about the history of Christian eschatology. Eschatology is a theological word we use to describe end times. And before I begin, I think it's important that we define our terms. It's very important when you get into a deep subject, you define your terms so everybody doesn't get confused. There are three major views on end times that are current in the church today, and each of these series or each of these views is subject to minor variations. Here's the three views. The first one is what we call it's historic. So what that means is this, that all the prophecies in the Bible concerning the events surrounding the second coming of Christ saw their fulfillment or implementation in the first century AD. This view is also called the a-millennial view. Now, don't get hung up on the terms, just hear what I'm trying to say. Then the next two viewpoints are what we call the futuristic viewpoints. And that is, they're yet to happen. The second view is what we call the pre-trib or pre-tribulation point of view, which believes that the church will be raptured or taken to heaven prior to the period of tribulation, which is spoken of in the Bible, which will happen in the end times before Jesus comes back again. And the third view, which is also futuristic, is commonly called post-trib or post-tribulation. And this view believes that the rapture of the church rising to be with Christ, coincides with the second coming of Jesus Christ. So the historic view we can say is amillennial, which means that either the millennium has already begun or it's past, or that there is no literal millennium to come. And the two futuristic views are pre-millennial, which means that the second coming of Christ will precede 1,000 years of peaceful reign by Jesus upon the earth. All right? You've just got, in the last 3 minutes, a full head full of what it's all about. And we're going to try and unravel it all for you a little this morning. I was going to say sorry about that, but this is what's going on. This is why a lot of people get confused over end times, simply because they don't understand the parameters in which it's taught. In Revelation 20, verses 2 to 3, in fact, all of Revelation chapter 20, you'll hear the 1,000 years spoken of many times. And we read this. We read, he, which is Jesus, laid hold of the dragon, that's Satan, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into a bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till 1,000 years were finished. And we call this period of 1,000 years of Christ's reign the millennium. Now, these are the three basic views of the Christian church regarding the order of things which precede the return or the second coming of Christ. Now, obviously, these three views cannot all be correct. Next week, we'll examine these views from a biblical point of view. So these three viewpoints, the futuristic, the historic, and the two futuristic ones, always have their starting point. They all have their starting point within the last 7 years of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. That's why we spent so much time a couple of weeks ago going through Daniel's 70-week prophecy. If we didn't get that right, we get into all sorts of problems. So that's why we spent some time, a whole Sunday, going through what were the exact times of that. And that's why we've been very precise about that, so we know what the Bible teaches. And as I've stated previously in the series, I believe that the book of Daniel is the blueprint of what will happen in the end times. It's a blueprint for the events which will lead up to the return of Jesus Christ. And the prophecies contained in the book of Daniel indicate there are four things that will precede the second coming of Christ. And the Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Thessalonians 5, 1-2 and verse 4 says, "But concerning the times and the seasons," that's the events happening in the end times, "brethren, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night." In other words, it's going to come very quickly. But you, and a lot of people will be unaware of it, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. So the church will be well aware of the events that are happening in the world that are preceding the second coming. So what are the four things that precede the second coming of Christ? Now, the first one is that Israel had to become a nation again. We saw that happen on the 14th of May in 1948. Secondly, a union of 10 nations will be formed in the Middle Eastern Mediterranean area. That's the feet of clay that we discussed in one of the images of Daniel, feet of clay and iron given to us in Daniel chapter 2. And the 10 toes on the feet represent the 10-nation confederacy. And I believe there will be 5 nations from the Middle East and another 5 from the Mediterranean section of the old Roman Empire, which will come together to form this 10-nation confederacy. Keep an eye on what is happening in the Middle East at the moment, as the nations are in uproar with various tribal sectors and religious sects rising against each other. Daniel 7 verse 24 says, "The 10 horns are 10 kings which shall arise from this kingdom." That's from the old Roman Empire. And there's a similar verse in Revelation 17, 12-13. It says, "The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they shall give their power and authority to the beast." And the third thing to look for is the rise of the Antichrist. Now that's a whole area of study which we'll be doing later in the year. We'll be doing a series on the Antichrist shortly where we'll talk more about this. He'll be a significant leader and will arise and take control of 3 of the nations, one of which will be Israel. Daniel 7 verse 24, "And another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue 3 kings." Now, the fourth thing to watch for is that the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. A lot of people wonder about this. Why is that? Because in Daniel 11 verses 36, it says, "Then the king," that's the Antichrist, "shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done." And Paul, writing in the New Testament in 2 Thessalonians verses 2, 3-4, picks up this whole thing. He says, "Let no one deceive you by any means. For this day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition," that's the Antichrist, "who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or is that worshipped. So he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." So the 4 signs pointing towards the second coming are, firstly, the restoration of the nation of Israel. We saw that in 1948. I was reading an old book which was published just before the Second World War by one of the notable writers on end times, and he says there's no way that the nation of Israel will be restored again. It needs to be restored. Some say it needs to be restored. It'll never happen. And neither will the other thing he wrote is, the Jews have gone through a terrible time. They'll never go through that again. And of course, the Holocaust happened about 5 years later. Interesting. Got to be careful what you write. So the four things are the restoration of the nation of Israel, 2, the 10-nation confederacy established in the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern area. Thirdly, the rise of the Antichrist who will take control of 3 of the 10 nations. And fourthly, the temple will be rebuilt and the Antichrist will ensconce himself in that temple, doing great miracles, just as we've read. So he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That's why it's called the Antichrist. He's in place of. The anti doesn't mean necessarily against. It means, in the Greek, it means to be in place of. So we've seen one of the 4 criteria met. Very little today is talked about the second point, the 10-nation union or confederacy. In the 50s, it was thought to be the EU, but of course the EU doesn't match it, simply because Israel was never part of the EU, and Israel's got to be part of it. But I believe that we are seeing a preliminary sorting out of that confederacy in the unrest that is going on in the Middle Eastern nations. Some have called that the Arab Spring. I call it God's autumn. Things have moved on from there. So with that background, we want to now look and see what the church down through the ages taught and believed. Did they endorse a historic viewpoint or a futuristic one? And if they endorsed a futuristic one, was it pre-tribulation? In other words, the church is taken out. This is believed by a major sector of the church today, that the church is raptured before the tribulation period, or post-trib. The church remains on earth throughout the tribulation period and is caught up to be with Christ when he returns a second time. So let's have a brief look at what the early church fathers believed. So without any doubt, we can say this about them. They had an expectancy regarding the second coming of Christ. Now, let's look at some of what they wrote. And the early church fathers, I'm talking about the period up to about 300 AD. The most important bit of documentation of the early church was a document called the Didache. And the Didache was an early church manual written about 125, within 100 years of the ministry of Christ. And the Didache was really a manual for new believers, for the people who were becoming Christians to read and understand what being a Christian was all about. It's one of the most important early church documents, and it's somewhat akin to what we would call today, the Alpha Course. It contains instruction about ethics and discipline for Christians. And it taught 3 things about Christians should be aware of the end times. It taught this, Christians should have 1, a spirit of expectation and watchfulness. 2, they should be alert to the rise of the Antichrist. And 3, they should watch for signs in the heavens and the sound of the trumpet when Christ returns. Those 3 things that it taught about end times. And I would say that's exactly the same that the church that needs to understand today. Then there was a guy called Justin Martyr. He actually ended up being a martyr. He was an earlier Christian apologist who lived about 150 AD. And he said this about the tribulation. He said, "For it is plain, though beheaded and crucified and thrown to wild beasts and chains and fire and all other kinds of torture, we do not give up our confession. But the more such things happen, the more do others and in larger numbers become faithful worshippers of God through the name of Jesus." So Justin Martyr believed a great harvest would occur during the tribulation time. And then Another early Christian theologian called Hippolytus was probably one of the most important Christian theologians in the early part of the 3rd century. And he wrote this. He says, there will remain only 1 week, the last, in which Elijah and Enoch will appear. And in the midst of the abomination of desolation will be manifest. Now, don't worry about what that is. We'll teach you about that later in the year. Will be manifested, the Antichrist announcing the desolation to the world, and when he comes, the sacrifice and oblation will be removed. He believed that the church would go through the tribulation. Then another guy in the 3rd century, early church father called Tertullian. And Tertullian said this, he said, as the conquering power of things, evil is on the increase, which is the evidence of the last days. And as we see things which are moving in the different nations of the world today, and we become very aware that there is something going on that we're very aware of that is bringing to naught anything that the Bible upholds. As the conquering power of things, evil is on the increase. So Tertullian also believed that the end would not come at any moment, but would first be indicated by signs of warning. And his hope was that as a Christian, he'd still be alive and standing after all these things had taken place. So he places the return of Christ to gather the church and the resurrection of the dead at the end of a series of preceding signs and events. And so do we. Now, there's pages of quotations that I could read this morning from the early church fathers. Those are quotations that were written prior to 300 AD. That would repeat from the early church fathers up to about 300 AD, that we can confidently state that they had their dominant expectation, and I say dominant, some were a-millennial, but most of them were what we call pre-millennial. They had an expectation of Christ's return. Secondly, they expected to see the Antichrist active in a 3.5-year tribulation period before Christ returns. They therefore did not believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. That is, that Christ could return at any time and take his church away before the tribulation. And nearly, if not all the church fathers I've read have mentioned that they as Christians would see the Antichrist and the 10-nation confederacy in action before the return of Christ. So we can say with some confidence that the early church did not have a historic view of eschatology, and neither did it have a pre-tribulation view of eschatology. Looking back, and we can painting with a broad brush, we can say this: the early church believed in a futuristic post-tribulation second coming, which ushers in the millennial reign of Christ. So what happened then? From about the 5th century onwards, through to the 18th century, the historic view of end times was promulgated by Augustine of Hippo, and he did that at by the Council of Ephesus, which was about 400 and, from memory, about 430, I think it was, AD. And this became the generally accepted view of the church probably about the next 1,000 years or so. So the historic view was that the millennial reign of Christ started sometime after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So according to this view, this what we call a-millennial view now, the millennium is either past or we're in it now. Whether it's right or wrong, whether that view's right or wrong, I rest my case as I look around the world. I hardly see the reign of Christ at the moment. Then, so from about the 3rd or 4th decade, then about from the 3rd or 4th decade of the 19th century, we saw a return to the early church's futuristic view. But that came in with a twist. And that twist was that there's a pre-tribulation rapture of the church. The church didn't go through a period of tribulation on the earth. Jesus said, in this world, to all his disciples, you'll have tribulation, but don't worry about it. Rejoice, I'm with you. You'll walk by faith through it. We'll talk about that next week. So the real next upset of the church's view of eschatology came in with the Reformation. The early church reformers saw the Roman Catholic Church as the epitome of Satan. And it's interesting to note that the Reformation discovered, I find this really, really amusing. The Reformation discovered that the Pope's name, Vicar Vicarius, added up to 666. Then the Jesuits went to town and they added up the name of Martin Luther. And they found that Martin Luther name added up to 6662. Interesting. If you're into eschatology, you'll know what I mean. It's the name of the Antichrist will add up to that as well. So out of the Reformation came what we would now call the Protestant view of end times. In other words, the church returned to the same view as the early church fathers held. And this was, in broad strokes, that a 10-nation confederacy would arise out of the remnants of the old Roman Empire. An Antichrist figure would take over 3 of the 10 nations, set himself up in the temple in Jerusalem for a period of 3.5 years, after which Christ would return. That's broad strokes. But in the late 1820s, there was a great Christian revival of interest in Christian things in the United Kingdom. And one small group which was involved in this Christian revival was called the Irvingites. It was run by an Anglican vicar called Edward Irving. And they're essentially a pre-charismatic group, and they attracted a lot of interest in the UK in 1827. And in Glasgow, Scotland, a young Scottish woman, part of the Irvingites, Margaret MacDonald, prophesied a pre-tribulation rapture of the church. And one of the leaders of the Plymouth Brethren at that time, J.N. Darby, was interested in the Irvingites and was attracted by this prophetic utterance, and he subsequently embellished it, and he took the concept to the USA, which he visited on numerous occasions in subsequent years. And so the idea of a pre-tribulation rapture was picked up and inserted into the notes of the Schofield Bible, and as we say, the rest is history. It's taught as a major theological theme by the Dallas Theological Seminary. I have to confess, I was brought up in this doctrine. However, my subsequent study and research and inquiry into the subject over several decades has meant that I've had to change my whole theological approach to end times. Simply put, I believe there are 4 things prophesied by Daniel yet to come. I should say 3, because of the 4, we've seen 1 happen already. Number 1, Israel will become a nation again. We've saw that happen. We've already seen it happen. The next thing to watch for is a 10-nation confederacy which will arise. You wonder why the Middle East is in our headlines every single day in the papers, on TV news. Why is that? It's a desolate area in many ways, and yet it's in the headlines. Why? Because that whole area is in uproar at the moment. Watch what will happen. There's a shaking going on. There's a movement of nations, and God is doing it, and out of it will come a 10-nation confederacy. Watch and see. And I believe an Antichrist figure will arise and take over 3 of the countries. In the Old Testament, there's more in the Old Testament about the Antichrist than what there is about Christ. Interesting. We'll come into that. And then he'll set himself up in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And these four events will precede 3.5 years of tribulation. That 3.5 years of tribulation and wrath will come basically upon the nation of Israel. They will affect us, but the focus of it will be, as Jeremiah 30 verse 7 says, it's a time of Jacob's troubles. These events must precede the second coming of Christ. And it's not a matter of sheer chance that the events that happen in the Middle East make our daily headlines. We need to remember that God is at work and his purposes will not be thwarted. We serve a God who has the affairs of the nations under his control. We serve a God who has planned out the purpose of this earth, and his purposes will not be thwarted. And the question which just comes out of this whole question is this to each one of us this morning. The question is, are you ready? We're on a journey. There is a destination ahead of us. And we're teaching on this so that we might be aware of the times in which we live. We've been essentially biblical in all the things that we teach. When will this happen next? I don't know. God's got the times in his hands. But one thing I know is simply this: we walk by faith and not by sight.